This session will examine Labour's relationship to different working class communities across the UK and will draw conclusions about the political, cultural and organisational changes the Labour Party needs to make better serve all working class people, regardless of race, gender, nationality or region. Right, that's the blurb. And when I read it, I thought, actually, this is a session that I can totally relate to, because despite the fact I've got really political parents who are trade unionists and did a lot of work back in my home country in Malaysia in building the socialist movement, when we came over here and I grew up here, I actually had absolutely nothing to do with politics whatsoever. I didn't actually honestly feel like I wanted to inhabit a party political space, despite actually voting Labour my whole life. And then being a mum and a single mum with 2 little kids, and thinking of how I engage with the Labour Party when CLP meetings at 7 p.m. on a Thursday when the kids are have to go to school, and it was just ridiculous. There's so many barriers to participation that I didn't really feel able to do anything about until recently. So that's why I think that actually the party is changing. It's really important that it does change, because people like me are able to join and become active. It was about 4 or 5 years ago. Timing was important. And I was, I can remember it really well, because my 2 little kids, one was in the bath and one was out of the bath, and we were running around, wouldn't put her pajamas on. I was getting really, really fucking stressed out. And at this point, I actually I think I hadn't had any real sleep for about 4 years. Total sleep deprivation. And I was like, just get your fucking pajamas on. And one was still in the bath and refusing to get out of the bath. The radio was on, and I heard the woman say, Jeremy Corbyn has got onto the ballot paper and might be leader of the Labour Party. I thought, well, that's a quite familiar name, actually. Don't know why. And a little later, when the kids had actually gone to bed, I called my mum, and I was like, what's this going on with the Labour Party and Jeremy thing? She was like, child, seriously. And she came over the next day, and she said, don't you remember all the protests we went to, all the solidarity marches, anti-apartheid movement? And then she told me the story of her own campaign. My dad was a political prisoner, and she campaigned a lot for his release from prison. And she got out this box and pulled a piece of paper out and put it in front of me. And I looked at it, and it was, so I still get shivers down my back when I tell this story. It was a letter calling for my dad's release from prison, signed Jeremy Corbyn. And I thought, the political space is changing. Maybe there is something I can do here. Maybe there is a space that I can inhabit and be a part of. So I'm very pleased to be here. Hello. Pleased you could join us. We have here with us today. Oh yeah, is that you? All right. So what do you do then? Chair of the Labour Party?
Yes.
That will do. We have Faiza Shaheen, class, director of class, and a candidate for Chingford and Woodford Green. Woo! Rhian E. Jones, I remembered the E. And we also have Dave Ward from CWU. And we are going to start with women first on my panels, always.
Can you all hear me? Great. Okay, I'm going to be starting off with some history, talking about the history of socialist culture in working class communities in the early 20th century and its relationship with the Labour Party, which is obviously a massive topic, so I can only really scratch the surface of it in the next 8 minutes. I'm also going to be drawing on my own experience and background growing up in the Welsh Valleys, because the Welsh Valleys are like a textbook, outstanding example of a place that was at one point defined by its industry, by ironworks and coal mines. And then since deindustrialisation in the 1980s and after, it's a place that's been defined by the lack of industry and by the absence of any replacement for that economic base. But the history of British mining communities, not simply in Wales, but also obviously in the northeast, parts of Scotland, also provides a really valuable example of how ordinary people developed a particular kind of culture, institutions, and infrastructure that was based around mutual support and collective provision in a way that we can call proto-socialist, if not actually existing socialism. So the first thing to understand is that this infrastructure was developed largely through the trade union movement, and it was underpinned by industrial organisation. Trade unions obviously predate the Labour Party. They've been around for over 300 years, developing as the Industrial Revolution created a mass industrial working class in this country, and these workers then gradually began to organise for better working and living conditions, including eventually establishing the Labour Party as the ultimate expression of political representation for organised labour. In the early 20th century, these industrial communities that developed had individual union branches and lodges based on particular workplaces and localities. And these organisations also took on a role that extended to welfare, as well as a social and cultural role. Their welfare function was particularly important because at this time, obviously there was little or no state provision for things like healthcare or financial support. This was pre-NHS, this was pre the development of the welfare state as we know it. So ordinary people began to create their own forms of welfare and support. The basic idea of how they did this was based on collectivist redistributive principles. The basic idea was that individuals would pay a small amount of money into a central fund over their lifetime to fund various services, and this then entitled them to help or support when they needed it. So in the years before the NHS, this system allowed unions to organise and pay for example, retirement homes and convalescent homes for their members. So when the members retired or they became ill or injured, they would be able to draw on these institutions and spend some time there being looked after and provided for after a lifetime of paying their dues, of paying into this fund. In my own town, Tredegar, in the Welsh Valleys, in the 1890s, local people set up something called the Tredegar Medical Aid Society, which again was funded by subscriptions from local people. You'd pay a bit of your wages in every week or every month, and this then provided medical care that was free at the point of use. Now, when the Labour MP in Iron Bevan, who was also from Tredegar, came to establish the NHS, this was the model that he drew on, that he extended. He used this very simple, localised model of socialised healthcare as a national blueprint. In terms of culture and leisure, workers were also active in campaigning for paid holidays, which sometimes it surprises people, like paid holidays weren't something that could be taken for granted. Bosses didn't automatically benevolently hand these down, they had to be fought for. So unions negotiated a holiday savings scheme with their employers, the National Coal Board, and with the government, which enabled mines to close for a week in the summer with guaranteed payments to each worker. Once this system was in place, miners would then organise their own holidays or day trips as a community, since the whole community would be on holiday at the same time, so they'd organise collective transport and accommodation. There were also local festivals and carnivals organised at various points in the year. The example of this that you might know is the Durham Miners' Gala, which is still with us after 150 years. So these used to happen all over the country. They were community days out that had both a social and a political function. There were also organised local music societies and sport and drama. Like there'd be particular brass bands attached to a particular pit or particular sports teams. So this was a culture that drew on local solidarities, on the idea of belonging to a certain community or neighbourhood and forms of civic pride, as well as being an extension of the collective resources involved in union organising. One fundamental material part of this infrastructure was something called the Miners' Institute, which could also be known as Working Men's Institute or the Workmen's Hall. But these were buildings that were constructed in individual industrial communities as a sort of multi-purpose social and cultural space. And again, these places were built on collectivist principles. Workers would pay a proportion of their wages into a communal fund to pay for the construction and the running, the staffing costs of the building. Sometimes they would even carry out the construction work themselves. These buildings were created in order to be part of the community, part of the social fabric. and they could be used for community meetings or to host political speakers or debates. Labour Party meetings were normally held there. There'd also be a bar in there, a space for dancing, a snooker room, a cinema. So it was a social and cultural space that was also suffused with particular political perspectives. And crucially, these buildings also always contained a library and a reading room where members could access books and newspapers for free. It's this aspect that highlights a particular tradition of self-education that was so important in these communities too. I feel the idea of self-education, the autodidactic tradition, defined so much of this early working class culture, and it's really been forgotten about in recent years, where education, the idea of education, is now associated with class aspiration, with transcendence, into the middle class. And the idea, if you become educated, then people tend to mean university educated when they say educated. And the idea goes along with that this somehow excludes working class people. The working class people aren't interested in educating themselves. But in early working class communities, self-education and access to knowledge and broadening your horizons was just a part of the cultural fabric. You gained this knowledge in order to understand the world, to understand your own place in it and your own conditions, not to transcend your class individually necessarily, but to improve yourself as part of that class, to collectively improve your class situation. So miners' libraries and libraries in general were a huge part of that tradition of political education. I'm just going to talk briefly about what happened to this culture, this infrastructure. There's not really very much to understand about it, unfortunately, because so much of this culture was based around specific industries, as were the communities that created it. It was particularly vulnerable to economic change and to deindustrialization. So the end of heavy industry in this country and the breaking of the unions had a catastrophic effect. I presume that Ian will talk about the particular impact of the miners' strike, so I'll just say that it's difficult to overstate how cataclysmic it was and how devastating its effects were. I was born just at the time of the miners' strike, and as a result, I was conscious of growing up basically in the ruins of an entire way of life. Sorry, I have much less time than I thought I had. Basically, given all these defeats that working class culture and working class communities have suffered over the past 30 years, it's a huge task to rebuild or renew it. I think it's important not to succumb to certain forms of nostalgia about these communities and this history. We know that they weren't socialist utopias. People often found them stifling, claustrophobic, patriarchal and reactionary in many ways. So we need to fold that into how we understand the particular benefits and security that they did offer to people. It's also important to acknowledge the working class as it looks today. Early 20th century working class culture was built on a particular economic base which is now gone, almost certainly forever, and we're not going to be able to replicate that. The contemporary working class contains sections of workers who have historically not been unionised, like retail and service workers. And yet it's these sectors recently that have emerged as militant and who have taken successful actions, thinking of things like the Deliveroo drivers, the McDonald's strike, Wetherspoons and Greggs workers. And it's also the case that the contemporary working class consists of workers who have historically often been neglected by unions and not thought of as part of the traditional working class, even though they've always formed part of the workforce. So I'm thinking of female workers, migrant workers, and young people. I'm sure we'll cover this later in the discussion, so I'll just touch briefly on it, but I think sections of both the right and the left can sometimes present an idea of the working class that's too narrow, that it consists entirely of white male industrial workers, when this has never been entirely accurate, and isn't accurate now. The culture that I've been discussing, I think, is a really important and valuable part of working class history, but it's never represented the British working class in its entirety. It's been one intertwined strand. Have I got one more minute?
I'm so sorry.
Thank you.
I think that was the Welsh reference.
Oh,
right.
I support you.
So that's great. Happy to be talking about class again. Running a think tank called Class is a sign that I am majorly obsessed with the topic. And, for some of us, the issue of class isn't something that we learnt in a textbook at university, is part of our lived experience. I was daughter of a car mechanic, and went through the state education system and managed to get into Oxford. And there's nothing that makes you realise what class you are until you go into those privileged circles and they make fun of the way you speak and ask you why you sound like you're from East End, why you're on EastEnders. Because I'm from the East End? I don't know. Look, this debate has angered me a lot, and we have completely gone down the wrong road. So I'm just going to start by stating some facts on working classness. Firstly, the British working class is multi-ethnic, and that's not a new thing. It's historically multi-ethnic. My great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents, they worked the land in Fiji, worked the land picking sugarcane, and that money flowed back to here, the profits from that. So no one can tell me that we're not working class. The working class live in the north, they live in the west, they live in the east, they live in the south, and they live in London as well. The working class were more likely not to vote in the EU referendum than to vote for Brexit. It's not the truth that we're told, but that's what it is. The working class and the white working class is not where racism is born. The white working class don't make decisions about who gets employed and who doesn't get employed. It doesn't explain why it is that austerity hit women of colour the most. George Osborne is the racist. I get more and more angry just thinking about all these things. And listen, the answer to the challenges of the working class is not social mobility. No, because in that idea, we're basically saying there's something wrong with being working class, that you have to leave your community, go, get some posh job in central London and lose the way your regional accent or the fact that you don't say your T's when you speak. That's just not the answer, and that's the answer we've been told, not just by Conservative governments, but unfortunately by previous Labour governments as well, that was the answer to working class challenges. These lies about the working class, which motivate me politically, motivated some research that Class did with the Runnymede Trust. And we went and spoke to working class people because we were fed up of things, of a narrative, of myths being told about working class people and not hearing those voices. So we started that research in London and hope to take it around elsewhere. So we interviewed 80 people across London. And what we found was that regardless of race, there were 4 things that they kept telling us about in terms of their lived experience, everyday working class lived experience. One is precariousness. So we called them the 4 Ps, just so we could remember them. Precariousness, power, prejudice, and place. So on precariousness, 0-hour contracts, the fact that they didn't know when they would get paid and how much they would get paid, precariousness in terms of housing, and precariousness in terms of immigration status. They told us about the lack of power they felt, that even when they did try, and this is the story of Grenfell, for instance, when they did come together and they did try and fight the forces that might be, they would be ignored. And they weren't given the space often to represent themselves. Thirdly, prejudice. And prejudice was felt in multiple ways, but unfortunately, the main instrument by which prejudice was being felt by the working class, or is being felt, is right now the state. So that when they walk into a housing office or a job centre, that they are judged. And this is something really important for us on the left to understand, that when we get a Labour government, not if, but when, we will need to rethink that, because there's incentives that have been put within our systems, whether it be through the Home Office or Department for Work and Pensions, that is just about punishing people, not about supporting. And we heard that again and again. And then finally on place, and obviously in London, but this is true of other parts of the country as well, that people really care about their communities and their place and the connections they have with one another. But they are being pushed out because of house prices, because of gentrification, and they feel like they are losing that anchor in their lives. So, those 4 things came up again and again and again, very similar experiences. But when we asked people at the end of these interviews whether they felt working class, Black and brown people would tell us, oh no, but don't I have to be white to be working class? Don't I have to go to the pub to be working class? This, unfortunately, has been the strength of the narrative of the working class in this country, which comes not just from our politicians, but from our TV screens as well. And, you know, that is the strength of it, that even though they are having the same experiences, and there would be so much power in the working class uniting, they think that, oh no, because I'm not white, I don't get to, you know, I can't partake in that. So how can Labour do better, and how can we address this issue? Just a few things that we spoke about, or we looked at in this study. So firstly, we need to make sure we don't repeat their language. We don't repeat the language of the white working class, that we do build a language around a united working class. We don't play into narratives like legitimate concerns, which pit the white working class against the immigrant community. We have to make sure that we build that solidarity in the way that we speak. Secondly, can we have working class people represent themselves? You know, it's quite shocking. I've seen over the last few years, even with Jeremy Corbyn as our leader, how we are sometimes promoting particular voices. And I'm too often in rooms where there aren't people that can talk about the, you know, lived experience, being on the receiving end of bad policy. We need to make sure that when we pick our MPs, when we pick representatives that are from those communities, that they can stand up for those communities because they understand that and live their experiences. They get the same buses, they go to the same schools. You know, there was something I was at a meeting about with the granddaughter of Emily Pankhurst the other day, and it was talking about what they did in terms of uniting women of different classes. And we were saying that actually apparently in suffragette meetings, it always had to be a working class female speaker. I think we do have to be quite hardcore about this and make some targets, because it's not okay. Thirdly, of course, all the stuff around council housing buildings, sorting out our schools, you know, all of that, like, and we don't have enough on this year on what we do on the welfare system to make sure it's supportive. We have to get all that policy right to tackle the precariousness. Obviously, unions are a big part of this, and I'm so glad that finally the Labour Party is back to being positive about the trade union movement. And I'm really excited about a department for Labour or a department for employment rights, because that right now the Department for Work and Pensions is just, again, it doesn't really stick up for workers, and it doesn't really think about collective bargaining and how we're going to bring people together. Creating local campaigns. This is really important because it's something that I've been using a lot in campaigning in Chingford and Woodford Green against Ian Duncan Smith, is finding things, well, and often people come to you themselves. They say, look, this is what's happening to my primary school, and then people come together around those public assets and they campaign together. You know, the number of accidental activists that are being born because of how much policy is going wrong, and we've got to encourage that. And just when we see the sparks of that, just try and encourage it even more. And let those people speak for themselves. Don't co-opt them, right? So just use the contacts. In that case, I used the contacts I had to make sure that they got media coverage. And then finally, one of the reasons that it's so easy to sow division and to demonize is because we just don't connect with each other anymore. We're not speaking to strangers. We're not doing the kind of coming in communal spaces and getting to really interact. You know, we need that way of humanizing to counter the demonization. So, you know, I think it's really important to any plan that Labour has about talking about how we're going to build those communal spaces. Or Harjoon Chang talks about public luxury spaces where we can come together and do that. It sounds really cheesy, but it is about the heart-to-heart connections that we have with people, because you stand up for each other when you care about each other. And when you don't, no one's going to believe, you know, people I grew up with, they're the first ones to come on my Twitter and get angry when people say Islamophobic stuff, even if they're white working class, because they love me. We grew up together. So, you know, that softer part of what Labour does is extremely important. And just finally, if we don't get this right, if we don't put this working class, you know, solidarity in the heart of what we do going forward, then we would have failed.
Right. So let me start by saying that I think that reshaping what working class means, redefining what it means and reasserting it in politics and across life is the absolute number one key to getting Labour elected. Two, I think it's crucial and fundamental, the thing that's going to stop the growing inequality that's happening right across the UK, across Europe, across the world. And I also think it's crucial for trade unions in terms of rejuvenating trade unions. But I agree that it can't be going back to the past. It's not about recreating all of the things then that was associated with that, but it is about connecting agendas. And this is something I think about a lot in terms of just day-to-day work that you do within a trade union. And I can't help think about it from a point of view of, you know, what happened in New Labour, what I experienced personally during that journey, and what's on offer now, and what our response to growing what's on offer now has to be. So, for example, as somebody who, you know, went in to meet people in New Labour years ago to talk about your industry, who you felt, it wasn't just that they would never turn up and talk to you on a picket line or stuff like that. It was a complete lack of understanding of what we were doing, what we stood for. And, you know, I have to say I felt sometimes amongst some senior Labour Party figures at the time and the professionals. It was when Labour became professionalised. And I'm not having a pop at any individual in that, because there's great people from all different classes who have got the right values. And of course, we all come together. But it was a feeling that we didn't belong anymore. And of course, the policies that were impacting on us at the time certainly made us feel that we didn't belong. So in our own industry, you'd be facing somebody senior in New Labour telling you that your industry didn't really have a future and that the only answer was it had to be privatised. And to go back to your members and explain that to them, that we were obviously not, you know, accepting of that, started this divide around, you know, why are we in the Labour Party? You know, they've walked away. I use this phrase a lot. Labour walked away from working class people, not the other way round. But I do think, the thing I think a lot about, I'm going to be completely open with you today on this, because I'm a passionate believer in everything I do. I try and bring people together. I think it's my number one job. Be firm on something, but always never write people off. Try and convince people that you have to get behind an argument that brings us all together, and that we have the real enemy in our sights and not the artificial divides that the enemy puts in front of us. And we know we're talking about, you know, the likes of Boris Johnson, very, very dangerous times. Everybody understands that. And I think what we need to do is find the connecting agenda. So as a trade union leader, if I look at our own union, we will have passionate people who have a particular agenda, and it can be on a range of issues. It can be on equality issues, it can be on industrial issues, it can be on political issues. And I see my job at every point along the way, because virtually all of those agendas I agree with, I see my job as finding the connector. And my concern sometimes is that when we don't find the connecting agenda and the connecting thing that brings us all together, which I would call working class, and it goes way beyond ethnicity, nationality, gender. Of course, it's about inequality, and it's about the people we are here to serve, in the same way that Boris Johnson, whatever he's going to say, is here to serve a certain constituency. We understand that, but people from our backgrounds who we are here to serve don't always just fall into the same place. They are able to convince them differently. I think we've got to find that connecting agenda. It's why on Brexit, you know, I'm here to make a plea as well. There's probably Remain, Leave voters in between in the room. I think we need to listen to this debate very carefully around how we deal with Brexit, because I remember back in 1968 watching Enoch Powell, and I was only young, but I remember sort of feeling this is strange, what's going on in this speech? And I remember seeing what was the Dockers Union. I didn't understand that at the time, I was only about 9 or 10, but I remember listening to people talking about it in the family and that, and seeing the Dockers Union marching with Enoch Powell. Now roll that on, and today that union's morphed into Unite, and a leader of that union, Len McCluskey, is you know, one of the most progressive people I've ever met, and would be out there fighting the racists and the fascists, along with probably all of you in this room. So my point is you have to, don't write people off. And I feel that if we don't approach the Brexit debate in the right way, because I tell you what I'm getting very passionate about now, I want to go to one of these towns and cities when Johnson or Farage are out there talking to working class people. I want to be there with people on this panel, with anybody in this room, and I want to put an alternative argument to those people. And I want to explain to them that it doesn't matter what ethnicity you are, it doesn't matter what nationality you are, it doesn't matter what gender you are. These people are not here to help you. And here's our agenda for helping you. And that essentially is the manifesto that Labour have, that will take people's life chances so far forward that I've never seen or felt anything like it in my lifetime. I'm desperate to get Labour elected. I'm desperate to get the trade union movement to play their role within that. And I think what I'm really saying is that we've got to assert, again, class politics. But it's a new type of class politics. I buy that 100%. You know, you have to be willing to listen to some of the points that are being made here about how you redefine that politics. But there's so much at stake, so much of our values and our history that is going to be tested like never before in my lifetime, and I really do mean that, over the next year or two, and obviously a pending general election, that we have to build and reshape working class politics again. We have to get more people in Parliament who come from different communities, and I'm up for that debate. I'm up for action on it. Our union supports events like this because we want new thinking to come through. We want to be a union that opens up our own. I've never been interested in the rules of the union and the structures and all of that stuff. People who know me, I've said this before, they know that. I want to build a union movement that fights for workers, political change, as well as supporting a leader of the Labour Party who can deliver it.
Thank you.
Listen, it's great to be here, by the way, with a fantastic panel. And it's really interesting listening to different views, you know, because I'm one of the only working class MPs we have left in the Commons. We've got, you know, after we win the election before Christmas, we probably will not have, we'll only have one former miner in the Commons, and that'll be me. Dennis Skinner is likely not to stand. Ronnie Campbell isn't standing. And it's really a sad state of affairs, you know, when we've got a party in the position we're in, which really doesn't reflect the country as a whole. And I'm proud, you know, to be working class. Some people say because you're a member of Parliament and you're on this fantastic wage, you're not working class anymore. I'm as working class as anybody in this place. I don't care what my wage is, because class isn't defined by how much money you get. I was brought up in a absolutely the identical place that Ryan mentioned before. I live in a place called Ashington, coal town. It's the epitome of working class. Everything is working class about Ashington. We built it, like was explained. We built the hospitals, we built the libraries, we built the schools, the miners. Even though the wages weren't that great, the miners put their hands in their backside pockets and paid to develop the towns in and around the mining class area, the working class areas. And I just think, for the first time in my life, I've been campaigning for the Labour Party, and I've been a member for 30 odd years, apart from when I got expelled. But I'll not get into that. And it was about class, by the way. That's what it was about. I got back in anyway. But my experiences, the miners' strike was something which developed me as an individual, the character that I am, whether it's right or wrong. But we struggled for a full year. We had the full force of Thatcher's government against hard-working, ordinary people. We had the judiciary system against her. We had the police against her. We had the government against her. It was horrific, it really was. I mean, I could tell you some amazing stories. But for me, it was the best experience in my life because of class. It was about, I wouldn't dispute that at all. But it was fantastic. You've just thrown us right off me thrust there, by the way. Thanks for that. Thanks for that. But I haven't been to university. The miners, the vast majority of miners haven't been to university. But I'll tell you what, they're as bright as anybody that has been to the best paid university in the country. And we know what class is about, and we know what solidarity is about. And we absolutely know the need to support each other. And we've got this moment of time, we've got a great opportunity with Corbyn's government, and with Corbyn in number 10. And we never forget the role of the trade unions, ever, because it's the labour and the trade union movement. One couldn't function without the other. The Labour Party couldn't have a campaign if it wasn't for guys like Dave and Len and the rest of them. Absolutely fantastic. And let me just say this in concluding. Oh, I've got loads of time. Let me just say, when we talk about class, it is really important, because the working class have been disenfranchised from politics. They've been battered to pieces for generations, for not just decades. I'm talking about generations. The issue with regards to 4.1 million children in poverty in this country as we speak here. That's about class. That isn't any one of those kids, 4.1 million kids, that isn't any of them got money, because if they had, they wouldn't be suffering hunger in the 6th richest economy in the world. We need to be investing in the likes of the National Health Service, because it's the class that use the services. If you've got money, you use private healthcare. And you can go on and on and on, because it actually is the silent class war, which has just basically obliterated society, as I said before, over a whole, years and years and years. I'm proud that my education was with people who, many hadn't a great education themselves, but you know what, the miners themselves, they knew what was right. They knew what was wrong. And it was a complete and utter education, just being part of the movement. You know what Scott Gill used to say about the miners' strike? He says, whether we won or lost, the victory was in the struggle itself. And I think that's absolutely true. And I'm going to say to the lady who shouted out at the back with regard to the women during the miners' strike. The women during the miners' strike were absolutely great. They weren't standing shoulder to shoulder with the miners. They were standing in front of her. They were absolutely brilliant. The miners' wives and everything that arrived from, the miners' wives themselves, what they did on the picket lines and speaking in meetings. And it brought the women's movement, certainly in places like mine, right to the fore. So it was absolutely fantastic. Class is a wonderful thing. The Labour Party, I think Dave mentioned this, the Labour Party lost the working classes. The Labour Party under Tony Blair believed quite clearly that everybody in here would vote Labour anyway. So why give them anything? That was like the general feeling. Now under Jeremy Corbyn, we've got, policies this week which will be announced, absolutely fantastic, and we're getting back to class politics, which is so essential. We cannot leave working class areas, whether it's in the north, whether it's in the south, because it's right what's being said, by the way. There's people, working class people in London, believe it or not. People tend to think that it's just these white working class areas up north. We've got people who are struggling, working class people right across the UK, and Corbyn's politics are looking to brings the equality and justice back to the nation. Why shouldn't working class people have hope? Why shouldn't working class people have aspirations? Why shouldn't working class people just say some natural justice in society? Because, generally, working class people don't want the world. They just want a bit of fairness. And, if they fall in hard times, maybe it's a welfare system. We've been attacked for ever and a day. And I'm absolutely proud to be the chairman of the Labour Party, a close friend of Jeremy's, a trade unionist before I'm a member of Parliament, because we're going to bring class politics back to this country. Thanks.